Hi everyone, welcome to week 9. Today's topic is about critical media literacy as educators. In my group, there is Kaitlyn Moore, Dipika Tanotra, Evan Walls, and myself, Anmol, Gill.
The article we will be looking at this week is titled Creating a Crisis, Selling Neoliberal Policy Through the Rebranding of Education, written by Parker L. in 2016.
What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is a term for different social and economic ideas. It is characterized by free market trade, deregulation of financial markets, mercantilism, and the shift away from the state welfare provision. Here we have a little video off of YouTube explaining what neoliberalism is.
Neoliberalism is a term for the political and economic policies associated with unrestrained free market global capitalism. The term was popularized in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and economist Milton Friedman, and is still prominent today. Proponents of neoliberalism see free markets and free trade as a foundation for human flourishing, creating the most favorable conditions for individual liberties, job growth, technological innovation, and transnational collaborations that promote peace and global prosperity. They believe that government interference with free market systems promotes waste, inefficiency, and stagnation. They reject regulations on industries, high taxation, and public services that are not subject to market competition, and believe in shrinking the size of government and restricting its functions to the protection of private property through policies and law enforcement, the facilitation of global commerce, and the maintenance of a strong military. Critics of neoliberalism argue that neoliberal policies exacerbate rather than mitigate economic and social inequalities. They cite the effects of unregulated capitalism and the reduction or removal of safety nets typically provided by governments to support those who are economically and socially vulnerable. More fundamentally, many critics assert that neoliberalism fails to account for structural forms of violence, such as systemic poverty, racism, and other forms of discrimination. They argue that these hinder equal access to the benefits of free market capitalism that neoliberals imply are universally shared. By failing to acknowledge structural forms of oppression, many neoliberals assert that it is individual failings rather than systemic inequality that lead to social and economic vulnerability. As with other political and economic systems, religions function to both support and challenge neoliberalism in local, national, and global contexts.
The first thing we're going to discuss is the relationship between neoliberalism and its effects on contemporary education policies. So the effects of neoliberalism on these policies is something that has been discussed among scholars within the last few decades. These scholars have questioned the neoliberal values and aim to find insight about how and why a policy in education is written and enacted. The author of this article focuses on whose voices are often missing in policy debates and formations, and shares how the public becomes compliant with these policies through the use of politically urging means. So with this, the author questions why the public continues to embrace neoliberal education policies that work against their own best interests, and how it is possible that they tend to become endorsed by the people who they alienate and marginalize the most. So these questions lead to the investigation and comparison of how education policies are sold to the public like products are sold to consumers.
So let's move on to point 2, theory and methods. Haworth's work explores the interrelationships among power, discourse, and policy. Haworth's political analysis being situated in a problem-driven approach is particularly relevant to this study. So Haworth's problem-driven framework has to do with the way local politicians try to create a crisis without substantive evidence to stimulate voter fear and to generate a new discourse of accountability that has become self-sustaining throughout the years. It is important to understand that after 21 years of accountability policy, there is a danger that educational success and achievement will only be measured through standardized test data. This article looks at the history of how such policies came to play and by what politicians. In keeping with Haworth's critical policy approach, the article attempts to flip the aim of the marketing literature and instead think about the following phases as rebranding education so it can be far from the problem of neoliberalism.
Our third point touches upon the idea of branding and neoliberalism, and more specifically, the branding of education in Ontario. So this article suggests that scholars around the world are increasingly concerned with the marketization of education in our province. It focuses on analyzing specific aspects of marketing and neoliberal policies, specifically in education, and this is branding. So branding, as we know it, is a component of marketization that targets consumer opinions and behavior. According to this article, the components of branding involve several phases, including phase one, identifying or creating a need. So this relates to the need creation, which was what the NDP created in the Royal Commission on Learning. So this was in response to widespread uncertainty and anxiety in society about education in Ontario. So this led to an increase in economic instability and an increase in accountability and globalized competition for the province, which eventually led to an increased expectation of students, which then led to standardized testing. So the second phase talks about offering and communicating a clear customer promise. So provincial politicians laid the foundation for a clear consumer province with measurable targets of achievement by stating that high quality education is something that we all want for our kids. To get it, we have to plan to make our school work smarter with a more challenging curriculum for higher standards, province-wide testing, and a focus on the basics of reading, writing, math, science, and technology. There will be better results, more accountability, and less waste, because it's time we put Ontario's kids back at the head of the class. The third phase focuses on making good on and improving this promise. So when Dalton McGuinty's Liberals won the 2003 election, they promised to make 75% of students reach the provisional level by making neoliberal mandates of markets, competition standards, and accountability. So this very benchmark took advantage of growing public support for accountability measures and also allowed the Premier to demonstrate that his government was better for education than that as those who were in office before him. So the final phase touches upon innovating beyond the familiar. So an example of this would be asking ourselves what we can do to increase student achievement, to reduce the gaps within these achievements with students, and to increase voter confidence in public education. So all in all, in conclusion, the author basically discusses and proposes that it is necessary to reconsider the overall purpose of education in our province. So he emphasizes the importance of becoming responsible for our education rather than accountable, with the sole purpose of omitting the neoliberal discourse in education so that it does not become the entire focus of how education and its policy formation can be in Ontario.
This article covers a wide array of information. It goes through a lot of facts and a lot of statistics and offers up a lot of opinions and think points. So choosing just one issue to agree or disagree with was pretty difficult. But the author said something that stood out to us, that we felt did a pretty good job at summarizing one of the main points in this article. That was that the practice of subjectively choosing a grade to represent proficiency, known as using cut scores, has been shown to be arbitrary. In other words, standardized methods cannot be used to set benchmarks for non standardized concepts like learning, nor can they be used when referring to non standardized subjects such as humans, who are diverse in an endless amount of aspects. We agreed with this. Proficiency, as defined by Google, is a high degree of competence, skill, or expertise. But I'm sure that we all know that we have tests that we didn't do so great on and others that we did. So, is it fair to base our skill or our competency off of one test? We didn't think so. Canada has a diverse population, and as such, this is reflected in classrooms around the country and throughout the provinces. Enter any classroom and you will see diversity of race, gender, cultural background, life experience, ability, and more. This all makes for different people, different types of learners, difference in expression, and so on. I'm sure we all can think back to when we were in grade school. There were some subjects that we did better in than others. You might have cringed at the thought of doing math or writing a math test, or maybe it was the book report or the essay that you struggled with, whereas others in your class seemed to shine and excel in these areas. Or maybe you did okay across the board until it came time for a test. You studied and, by all accounts, knew the material pretty well, but it just never seemed to come through when you needed it to, when that test is sitting right in front of you, especially in EQAO years, when the pressure is built all year. All you hear about is EQAO this and EQAO that. This will be on the test. You're going to need to know this. Even if you don't have any form of test anxiety, this has got to be stressful. So, again, is it fair to use the scores from these tests to determine the competency or proficiency of students? When I was practice teaching, it was clear that almost each student varied in how they best expressed their understanding of material. Some students couldn't wait until it was time to do a drawing or make an art piece. Others loved to stand in front of the class and talk about all that they've learned so far within a unit. But I had one student in particular who had really severe test anxiety. As a result, they wrote modified tests in separate areas of the classroom or sometimes in other classrooms entirely. If not, this student would just sit there for the entire test period, sometimes without writing a single thing. This was really frustrating and put a lot of stress on the student, but it was no reflection or testament to their level of intelligence or comprehension capabilities. In fact, if you took the time to talk to this student or to go over their work throughout the unit, you would see that they had an excellent understanding of the concepts that they were learning. But I wonder what the conclusion standardized tests would draw about this student and her performance on tests like EQAO. Is that fair? We didn't think so.
How are the issues in the article related to broader questions in education today? Here we're going to make a text-to-world connection with the article. For example, not everyone can test well. This does not mean that the kids who score low do not know what they are doing. So how can this be a great means of knowing how well the youth of today are actually doing? It's hard to take any sides because we've grown up doing EQAO tests and literacy tests. Speaking as a student, our parents and teachers drilled that we had to do well on these tests. Now studying in education has given me a different perspective. During our placement, I was placed in a grade 6 classroom, and our associate teacher told us that she had to focus on EQAO styled questions rather than teaching them different methods and styles. This puts limitations on students and teachers and only allows them to be successful with one train of thinking. So why are standardized tests the means of measuring if our students are living up to the 75% standard?
Another issue that I found that could be related back to this article in a text to world connection is actually Doug Ford's math proficiency test. New Ontario teachers are required to score at least 70% on a mathematics proficiency test in order to teach professionally. This doesn't mean simply that new teachers must take a proficiency mathematics test, but that all new teachers, regardless of the discipline, will have to take this math test. So the question here is, how does a student's laziness or unwillingness to learn be bettered by a standardized test that a teacher has to take? It's just something to think about, I think.
Should we get rid of standardized testing? Although standardized testing is a particularly hot topic in education right now, this approach to measurement has been used for many years. And while the results of standardized testing can help us understand some things, they can also be misleading if used correctly. So what do those tests actually measure? So please take a look at this TED Talk video we will be presenting and enjoy.
The first standardized tests that we know of were administered in China over 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty. Chinese officials used them to determine aptitude for various government posts. The subject matter included philosophy, farming, and even military tactics. Standardized tests continued to be used around the world for the next 2 millennia, and today they're used for everything from evaluating stair climbs for firefighters in France to language examinations for diplomats in Canada to students in schools. Some standardized tests measure scores only in relation to the results of other test takers. Others measure performances on how well test takers meet predetermined criteria. So, the stair climb for the firefighter could be measured by comparing the time of the climb to that of all other firefighters. This might be expressed in what many call a bell curve. Or it could be evaluated with reference to set criteria, such as carrying a certain amount of weight, a certain distance, up a certain number of stairs. Similarly, the diplomat might be measured against other test-taking diplomats, or against a set of fixed criteria which demonstrate different levels of language proficiency. And all of these results can be expressed using something called a percentile. If a diplomat is in the 70th percentile, 70% of test takers scored below her. If she scored in the 30th percentile, 70% of test takers scored above her. Although standardized tests are sometimes controversial, they're simply a tool. As a thought experiment, think of a standardized test as a ruler. A ruler's usefulness depends on 2 things. First, the job we ask it to do. Our ruler can't measure the temperature outside or how loud someone's singing. Second, the ruler's usefulness depends on its design. Say you need to measure the circumference of an orange. Our ruler measures length, which is the right quantity, but it hasn't been designed with the flexibility required for the task at hand. So, if standardized tests are given the wrong job or aren't designed properly, they may end up measuring the wrong things. In the case of schools, students with test anxiety may have trouble performing their best on a standardized test, not because they don't know the answers, but because they're feeling too nervous to share what they've learned. Students with reading challenges may struggle with the wording of a math problem, so their test results may better reflect their literacy rather than numeracy skills. And students who are confused by examples on tests that contain unfamiliar cultural references may do poorly, telling us more about the test taker's cultural familiarity than their academic learning. In these cases, the tests may need to be designed differently. Standardized tests can also have a hard time measuring abstract characteristics or skills, such as creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. If we design a test poorly or ask it to do the wrong job, or a job it's not very good at, the results may not be reliable or valid. Reliability and validity are 2 critical ideas for understanding standardized tests. To understand the difference between them, we can use the metaphor of 2 broken thermometers. An unreliable thermometer gives you a different reading each time you take your temperature. and the reliable but invalid thermometer is consistently 10 degrees too hot. Validity also depends on accurate interpretations of results. If people say the results of a test mean something they don't, that test may have a validity problem. Just as we wouldn't expect a ruler to tell us how much an elephant weighs or what it had for breakfast, we can't expect standardized tests alone to reliably tell us how smart someone is, how diplomats will handle a tough situation, or how brave a firefighter might turn out to be. So, standardized tests may help us learn a little about a lot of people in a short time, but they usually can't tell us a lot about a single person. Many social scientists worry about test scores resulting in sweeping and often negative changes for test takers, sometimes with long-term life consequences. We can't blame the tests, though. It's up to us to use the right tests for the right jobs and to interpret results appropriately. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, we highly recommend a best-selling book called The End of Average by Harvard professor Todd Rose.
In today's discussion, we'll be focusing on 3 questions we would like to explore with the class. Question number 1. Do you agree or disagree with standardized testing? If you disagree with this type of testing, what else could you use in order to measure a student's success?
Question number 2. Choose a statement. Do you agree or disagree with this statement and explain why? A. An increase in accountability and implementation of standardized testing allows for a more competitive province in a ruthless, globalized economy. Or B. The primary purpose of schooling is not to train students for a particular job or to turn out a product, or to make Ontario more competitive in a globalized economy.
In the article, the author states, "It is important to note that the policies have built the foundation for a curriculum of accountability that defines achievement as meeting the provincial level on a standardized test, and in turn offers politicians a quantitative platform from which to base future brand innovations." Do you believe that the current curriculums and classroom practices that are in place are too political or designed in some way to advance political innovations? If yes, what could be done in classrooms to refocus learning on multiliteracies and ensure a more authentic experience? In your answer, you may want to consider things like the ongoing debates over sex education curriculums, the national anthem, and even the Pledge of Allegiance that's said every day in some American school systems. You may even want to think about our current situation and the mandating or non mandating of mask wearing, social distancing, or just how COVID is being handled overall in certain schools and certain school boards. Are these things just a part of life and in thus education? Or do they open the door to making schools too political? Should this be left up to the parents? I think most of us would agree that you can't please everyone. And just because something is controversial or causes upset among some people doesn't necessarily mean we can do away with it. So, is there a better way that educators should go about certain issues? Or is it possible that all is already being done and there really is no issue? What do you think?
Thank you for listening. Feel free to leave us feedback, and we look forward to seeing what questions you have for us. Enjoy!